The storm arrived without warning, the way the worst ones always do. One minute the world was still breathing. The next, the mountains vanished beneath a white shroud that swallowed everything. High in the southern Rocky Mountains of northern New Mexico, the wind rose with a fury that felt torn from another century. And Matthew Hernandez had only just enough time to grab the reins of his horse and push hard toward the cave. He had set out early that morning to check the rabbit traps he laid every winter, a habit passed down from his grandfather. In the mountain communities, no one relied solely on the town stores. Self-sufficiency wasn't a trend. It was a rule of survival. But that day, the cold came all at once. In less than half an hour, the temperature dropped nearly 20 degrees. The sky, clear just moments before, turned the color of old lead, heavy, low, and threatening. The wind came down from the north as if it had crossed straight from the high plains, dry and merciless. The snow didn't fall. It attacked. It came sideways, slashing, biting into exposed skin like a blade. "Come on, Star!" Matthew shouted at his horse, yanking the reins with all his strength. "To the cave!" Star obeyed without hesitation, though she could barely see more than a few feet ahead. Matthew moved almost blind, guided by memory alone. He knew every bend in the trail, every large stone, every twisted juniper. He knew that if he missed the entrance by even a few yards, he wouldn't survive an hour. This wasn't an ordinary snowfall. This was a killer storm, the kind that carved itself into collective memory and was told and retold for generations. Then he saw it, a dark opening cut into the rock wall, a deep shadow in the middle of the absolute white. The mouth of the cave. And inside it, barely visible, stood the structure that had sparked laughter, mockery, and whispered rumors for more than a year. The cabin Matthew had built inside the cave. In town they called it the madman's house. Others, more cruel, called it the hermit's hole. For the people of Pine Ridge Hollow, homes were meant to stand in plain sight, with wooden walls, tin or shingle roofs, and a yard where laundry could hang in the sun. Living inside a cave wasn't just strange. It was shameful. Matthew urged Star forward, and the moment they passed through the narrow entrance, the roar of the wind died almost completely. It didn't vanish, but it retreated, muffled by stone. The air was still cold, yes, but it no longer sliced through the lungs. The cave was already doing its work. He went deeper until he reached the main chamber. There stood his cabin, solid, built from carefully fitted logs, a house within a house, surrounded by millions of years of limestone. The door sat several yards back from the entrance, creating a natural buffer zone. Matthew led Star to the small stable he had built along one side, also inside the cave, and covered her damp back with thick blankets. "You're safe now," he murmured, running a hand along her neck. "We made it." From the glass window, real glass, hauled carefully from the nearest city, he could see the cave's entrance. Beyond it, there was nothing but white chaos. The storm that would later be remembered as the worst in the region's history had begun, and it would not stop for 5 days. But inside the cave, Matthew had everything he needed. Dry firewood stacked in a protected corner. Beans and corn stored in heavy sacks. Salted meat hanging far from moisture. Deeper inside, a narrow stream flowed year-round, clear and steady. No wind could reach him. No snowfall could bury his home. While outside the mountains were turning into a death trap, inside the cave there was a tense, almost sacred calm. The cabin everyone had ridiculed was about to prove its worth. And to understand why a man would choose to build his home inside a cave, ignoring the mockery of an entire town, you had to go back to the beginning. It had all started the previous spring, when Matthew Hernandez returned to the mountains for good after years working as a laborer and surveyor on construction projects across the Southwest. With the money he'd saved, he bought land no one else wanted, 50 acres of rocky slopes, twisted pines, and a deep cave the locals had always known about, but only used occasionally as shelter for livestock. "What do you want that for?" the county land clerk asked as Matthew signed the papers. "You can't grow anything there." "I'm not planning to farm," Matthew replied. "I'm going to live there." The news spread through Pine Ridge Hollow faster than smoke from a campfire. Matthew Hernandez, the quiet kid who'd come back from the road with strange ideas, was planning to build his house inside the cave. At Don Eusebio's general store. In the roadside bar. In the line at the grain mill. Everyone talked about the same thing. "That's no way to live," said Mrs. Remington, crossing herself. "Caves are damp and dark. That's where snakes and bats live. He'll get sick. Or the mountain will collapse on him," someone else muttered. Matthew heard the comments calmly. He didn't argue. He knew no one spoke out of cruelty. They spoke out of habit. In the mountains, you did what had always been done. Wooden houses facing the sun. A stove at the center. Thick blankets for winter. But Matthew had learned something different during his years away. He had worked surveying land in harsh mountain zones, studying airflow, temperatures, and terrain. He had slept in caves during storms and noticed something others ignored. While outside the weather shifted violently, inside the rock, everything remained almost unchanged. The cave on the property was large, dry, and elevated. There were no signs of past flooding. The air moved naturally. The temperature stayed steady, cool in the summer, and surprisingly mild in winter. To Matthew, it wasn't a primitive hiding place. It was a perfect structure shaped by nature itself. He began working alone. At dawn, he first cleared the main chamber, removing loose stones and leveling the ground. Each strike of the pickaxe echoed through the cave like an ancient drum. Neighbors stopped by to watch, leaning on imaginary fences. "Look at him," they laughed, joking about cavemen. Matthew didn't stop. He marked the exact spot where the cabin would stand, calculating distances, airflow, and the most stable zones. He used pine and oak logs, legally cut and carefully treated. Every wall was raised with precision. He didn't improvise. He measured, adjusted, reinforced. The design was simple but smart. Windows facing the entrance to capture natural light. A slightly sloped roof to prevent moisture buildup. A stovepipe connected to a natural crack in the rock that worked as a perfect draft. He tested the system again and again before considering it finished. "It'll fill with smoke," people said. It didn't. Then he built a small stable inside the cave, separate from the living space, with room to store hay and protect the animal from the cold and from predators. Star adapted quickly. Horses, as Matthew knew, understand safety before humans do. Over the summer, the cabin took shape. What had looked like madness began to look solid. Even so, no one admitted it out loud. In town, the bets continued. "Give it one winter," they said. "When the real cold hits, he'll run back." Matthew moved in during the fall. He cooked beans on his stove, read at night by the glow of oil lamps. He listened to the rain strike the mountain uselessly. While wind slipped through cracks and rattled metal roofs in town, a firm silence ruled inside the cave. What he felt wasn't loneliness. It was protection. And though no one knew it yet, that winter would challenge everything Pine Ridge Hollow believed about shelter, tradition, and survival. The first signs arrived a day before the storm unleashed its full fury. Matthew recognized them immediately, not from superstition, but from experience. The air grew dense, as if the mountains were holding their breath. The barometer hanging beside the cabin door showed a sharp drop. Too sharp. That afternoon, even Star was restless. She pawed the stable floor, flicked her ears constantly. Animals always knew first. "Something big is coming," Matthew murmured as he checked his supplies. He had enough dry firewood stacked deep inside the cave, protected from moisture. Sacks of beans, rice, and corn. Clean water from the underground stream that never dried up. Candles, lamps, thick wool blankets like the ones a few of the older families in town still wove by hand. He was ready. What he didn't know was that this wouldn't be an ordinary mountain storm. It would be a snowfall unlike anything seen in decades. Night fell early. The wind began as a whisper, then turned into a sharp whistle racing through the mountains. From the cave entrance, Matthew watched the first flakes transform into a solid curtain. Snow began to fall sideways, driven by violent gusts. In Pine Ridge Hollow, people rushed to shut doors and windows. Some were still on the main road when the cold became unbearable. In less than an hour, the temperature collapsed. Water in buckets began to freeze. Wooden homes, built for heat, started to fail. Wind forced its way through invisible cracks. Snow piled up against doors. In some houses, chimneys clogged with drifting snow, filling rooms with smoke. Families crowded into a single room, sharing blankets, whispering prayers. Meanwhile, inside the cave, the noise outside was only a distant murmur. The wind couldn't get in. The stone absorbed the chaos. Matthew lit the stove calmly. He didn't need much wood. The temperature inside the cave stayed stable, nearly constant, as if winter wasn't allowed to cross that threshold. He cooked something simple and ate slowly, listening to stars' steady breathing on the other side of the wall. The first day passed like that. Then the second. The storm didn't let up. Outside, snow rose higher than a man in some places. Roads vanished. No one could enter or leave town. Firewood supplies began to run out. The cold sank into bones, especially the elderly and children. In one house, a family burned furniture to stay warm. In another, a metal roof tore free under a violent gust, leaving the home exposed to ice and wind. Fear became constant. Inside the cave, life went on. Matthew kept his routine. He cared for Star. He cooked. He cleaned. He read. Each night he slept without the wind hammering the walls, without the threatening creak of a struggling structure. On the third day, the storm reached its cruelest point. The snow didn't stop for even a second. The cold turned lethal. In town, some people tried to leave to seek help and never came back. Silence began replacing light in several homes. Matthew stepped closer to the protected entrance of the cave and looked outside. The world was unrecognizable, white, violent, endless. And yet he could observe it without danger. It was like watching a catastrophe from behind an invisible wall. They had been right about one thing, he thought. This was unnatural, but not the cave. On the fifth day, the wind finally began to ease. The snow fell with less force. The barometer climbed slowly. Matthew knew the worst had passed. When he finally stepped outside, the landscape looked like another planet. Trails had vanished. Trees lay split under the weight of ice. It took hours to make his way with Star back toward town. What he found was devastation. Damaged homes, collapsed chimneys, people exhausted and shaking. The cold had taken its toll. When the residents of Pine Ridge Hollow saw Matthew arrive clean and unhurt, his horse strong and well-fed, they fell silent. How did you survive?" someone asked, their voice breaking. Matthew answered with a single word. "The cave." And in that moment, something began to change. The silence that followed the word cave spoke louder than any speech. No one laughed. No one joked. On the worn faces of Pine Ridge Hollow, there was no room left for mockery. Only disbelief, shame, and a question no one dared to say out loud. What if he had been right? Matthew dismounted slowly, helping those who needed it most first. He shared what little he had with him, promising to return with more. He didn't speak of pride or revenge. In the mountains, survival had always been a collective matter, even when each family believed it managed alone. "There's space," he finally said. "Not for everyone, but for the most vulnerable." That same afternoon, a small group followed him up the mountain. 2 elderly men, a woman carrying a sick child, and a man injured by a falling beam. They moved slowly through hardened snow. No one complained. The cold had taught them all to conserve their strength. When they crossed the cave's entrance, the change was immediate. The wind was left behind, as if an invisible door had been closed. The air, though still cold, no longer bit. They stopped in surprise, breathing in relief. "It feels like another world," the woman whispered. Matthew led them into the main chamber. The cabin, lit by lamps, seemed unreal, almost warm. The child stopped trembling after a while. The elderly men sat and closed their eyes, exhausted. That night, for the first time since the storm began, no one prayed to survive. They prayed to give thanks. The news spread quickly, even without roads. The next day, more people arrived. Not everyone could stay, but Matthew organized shifts, spaces, blankets. Star remained calm, accepting the human presence as if she understood the urgency of the moment. When the weather finally stabilized, the count was harsh. Several lives lost. Damage that would take months to repair. But the cave had made the difference. 2 days later, a member of the town council climbed up to see it. "I never thought I'd say this," he admitted, "but would you be willing to let this work as a community shelter?" Matthew didn't answer right away. He looked at the ancient stone, the cabin, the people sleeping near the fire. "Yes," he said at last. "But it's not magic. It's knowledge and respect for the place." The town changed from that point on. Not everyone built in caves. Not everyone could. But they began to think differently. Homes oriented toward natural shelter. Double walls. Protected entrances. Less fighting the mountain, more working with it. Some of the younger folks asked Matthew to teach them. They measured land. Studied air currents. Learned to observe signs they had once ignored. The word crazy disappeared from the vocabulary when people spoke about him. Months later, a journalist from Santa Fe arrived looking for stories about the great snowfall. He expected tragedy. He found a lesson. "When you built here," he asked, "didn't you doubt?" Matthew smiled faintly. "Of course I doubted. But I doubted myself, not the place. Stone doesn't lie. And solitude isn't loneliness when you're safe. It's silence. And silence teaches." The cave was better equipped. Sleeping platforms. Storage areas. Clear markers. When winter threatened, people knew where to go. Years later, no one remembered exactly who had laughed first. They only remembered who had thought differently when it mattered most. At the cave's entrance, someone placed a simple hand-carved plaque. Here, when the cold tried to win, the mountain protected those who knew how to listen. Matthew never asked for recognition. For him, the real victory wasn't being right. It was turning ridicule into learning. Because in Pine Ridge Hollow, winter was no longer just an enemy. It was a test. And now they knew how to pass it. The years moved on the way they always do in the mountains, without hurry, but without stopping. Pine Ridge Hollow was never the same after that winter, not because fear had settled in forever, but because the understanding of shelter, safety, and nature changed at its core. The cave stopped being the madman's house. It became the refuge. When the weather worsened, when the wind came down from the north carrying promises of ice, families knew what to do. Children grew up hearing the story not as a warning, but as a lesson. It wasn't about hiding underground. It was about learning how to read the land. Matthew grew old there, between stone and silence. He never married, but he was never alone. Someone was always coming up with fresh bread, goat cheese, or roasted coffee. In return, he taught how to watch the clouds, how to feel pressure changes in your ears, how an air current can tell you more than any forecast. Star grew old too. When she died, Matthew hung her favorite horseshoe on the stable wall, with a simple inscription carved into wood. Star, who trusted when others doubted. Years later, another strong storm struck the region. Not as devastating as the first, but enough to test what had been learned. No one panicked. The elderly were taken to the cave ahead of time. Children played among blankets while the wind roared outside. The refuge worked exactly as it should. Some time later, a group of architecture students arrived to study the site. They took notes, made sketches, measured temperatures. "It's not just the cave," one of them said. "It's the decision." Matthew nodded. The cave had always been there. The difference was listening to it. When Matthew died, he did so peacefully in his bed, with the mountain unmoving above him. The town honored his wish. The cabin would not be sold or altered. It would remain open as a shelter for anyone who needed it. At the entrance, beside the old plaque, they added another phrase carved into stone by local hands. "Mockery does not survive winter. Knowledge does." Today, those who pass through Pine Ridge Hollow hear the story and smile. Some still doubt. Others understand immediately. But everyone looks at the mountain with new respect. Because they learn something that doesn't appear in books or maps, that sometimes the strongest shelter is the least visible, that wisdom often looks strange before it looks obvious, and that when nature shows its true face, only those who stop fighting it survive. The cave is still there. Silent. Steady. Waiting as it always has.